I apologize in advance because there's so much information, and I had 150 slides, which was way too long. So here we go. Ulysses S. Grant, I think, was the first modern president. This is an artist's representation of his home where he was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, April 27th, 1822. Of course, he was named Hiram Ulysses Grant, not Ulysses S. Grant. Therefore, his initials were H-U-G, not U-S-G. It was a mistake he used to his advantage when he enrolled at West Point, nominated by Congressman Thomas Hamer in 1839. Grant was about 5 foot tall at enrollment in West Point, barely making the height requirement, which was 5 foot. But he did grow 7 inches during his 4 years at the academy. He was taught at several private schools during his youth because his father believed that education was important for an enriched life. But he seemed uninterested in most subjects beyond arithmetic, which he excelled at. And here is a wooden nickel portraying one of his schoolhouses. His father was Jesse Root Grant, his mother, Hannah Simpson Grant. The Grants had, I think that Ulysses was the 7th or 8th generation from when the Grants immigrated from England to the US. They first went to Connecticut and then migrated thereafter to the Western frontier, which was then Ohio. Grant served as president from 1869 to 1878, and he succeeded Andrew Johnson, who ascended to the presidency after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Grant's father was a tanner, and Grant hated it, so he muddled about during his youth, only enjoying working with horses, which served him well in his later life. But he did not enjoy hunting, although his classmates took him hunting. He never even fired a shot, although he kept his rifle with him. So they would hunt wild turkey and geese and other birds and raccoons and other game, but he never fired a shot. At the tannery, the reason he hated it, there were gases that were noxious. The tanning fluids were acidic and smelly, and the process of dehairing and removing the flesh was grueling to him and unpleasant. He tried, but tired of the whole effort. When he was nominated to the U.S. Military Academy in 1839 at age 17, his patron was Congressman Thomas L. Hamer. And Hamer listed his name as U.S. Grant, thinking his mother's maiden name, Simpson, was his middle name. After acceptance, Grant protested to the Academy and was told he must enroll as U.S. Grant, or he could reapply the following year as Hiram Ulysses Grant, his birth name. He thought, I didn't want to go back to the tannery for a year, so I will just enroll as U.S. Grant, although the S did not mean anything to him. But of course, for the other cadets and the hazing that took part, as it does in a male establishment, U.S. soon became Uncle Sam, or United States, and they naturally shortened it to Sam. Grant was mostly uninterested as a student at West Point. His only saving grace was his prowess as a horseman, allowing him to remain at the academy. The academy was an engineering school, and what they did is they taught French and had the students translate French articles and books on engineering into English, and Grant was terrible at that. But he was a good horseman, and because the academy finally developed a horsemanship class, he became adept at that, and that's why they left him in the academy. While he was at the academy, he became a great reader of novels and adventure books. His preferred books were those of James Fenimore Cooper, the Leatherstocking Tales, which were published between 1835 and 1845 or so, Edward Bulwer Lytton, and Sir Walter Scott. All these books depicted young men questing, adventuring, and struggling to fit into a rapidly changing world. So they were very good for Grant because that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to figure out where his life would lead him. and he had no desire to return to his father's business of tanning. So the military was his reluctant option. He graduated 21 of 39 students in 1843. French and other engineering studies were difficult, although he did excel in topographical maps and line drawing. And this is one of his line drawings showing a draft horse with a feed bag on its face. It's a pencil and ink. And here's another of his paintings, a watercolor showing Indians with a trader trading goods with them, with a mother holding a child at her breast. Most of the drawings and paintings that have survived are kept in some museums devoted to Grant. His only award at the Academy was as an outstanding horseman. But one story has Grant's graduating class assembled on horseback for the final time inside the Academy's riding academy and to perform their final riding exercises before the superintendent. With a number of spectators, civilians, and family and visitors observing, Grant was summoned from the group and ordered to guide his horse to jump over a bar, which had been raised more than a man's height. Grant and his horse succeeded, and then the graduating class was dismissed. Fellow students included James Longstreet, a future Confederate general, and Frederick Dent, brother of his future wife, Julia. And here are some portraits of Julia as a young woman and as First Lady. How did he achieve such grand accomplishments? Becoming the general of the armies for the North during the Civil War and securing the surrender of General Lee, and thereafter becoming president of the United States. And the answer lies in his greatest trait, relentlessness. Thus, in his own words, one of my superstitions had always been when I started to go anywhere or to do anything, not to turn back or stop until the thing intended was accomplished. So that was Grant in a nutshell. His first military successes came in the Mexican War, where as a young lieutenant, he fought and was allowed, even though he was a quartermaster or a supply officer, he was allowed to go to the front a couple of times. And one of his exploits was he went to the front and was confronted with the lack of ammunition by the troops that were there at the front fighting. And so he volunteered to go back through the lines of the Mexicans, and he rode his horse, moving his body so that only his foot showed, and he was holding on to the horse's throat or neck. And he rode as fast as he could through the Mexican lines and was not hit by any of the firing that happened, and got the ammunition and brought it back to the people who were out of ammunition at the time. After the Mexican War ended, he was posted to Detroit, then to Madison Barracks in Sackett's Harbor, New York, then back to Detroit. The only saving grace for him was he had been able to marry Julia Dent on August 22nd, 1848. After gold was discovered in California in 1848, Grant's unit was posted to Fort Vancouver, Washington Territory. His efforts in shepherding a group of military and civilians over the Isthmus of Panama grew his stature. And what happened was the group of civilians and military men were put on a steamboat and landed at Aspinwall in Panama. And there they had to go overland to get to the Pacific coast. While they were going overland by canoe and on foot and so on, a lot of the soldiers contracted cholera. And cholera is a disease, a bacterial disease that causes diarrhea. And it's so severe that if it's not treated early, people could die from the lack of fluids in their body. So cholera on this trip mostly affected the soldiers. And that was noted in the journals and the diaries that the people kept. So the women and the children who were on the trip did not really contract cholera, only the soldiers. And it's probably because they were drinking heavily on the trip, and then they were not careful with the water and the food that they consumed, and you acquire cholera from tainted water and or food. Of the nearly 700 people started the voyage. About 450 made the ship, taking them to San Francisco. Grant explored 1852 San Francisco before departing for Fort Vancouver, which was then known as Columbia Barracks. And his wife had been left behind in Illinois because she was pregnant. In 1852 San Francisco, it contained about 100,000 people due to the gold find up in Sacramento County. And that compares to Yerba Buena, which was its prior name, and it only had about 450 souls in 1847. Fort Vancouver was lonely for Grant, so he began to drink. And it's disputed how much he drank, but it affected his later life. He met a former Westport classmate, Rufus Ingalls, at the fort, shared quarters and expenses with Ingalls and another soldier, Thomas Brent. In due time, he learned that his son, his second child, Ulysses S. Grant Jr., had been born. During this period, Grant was encouraged to invest in numerous ventures and schemes, none of which came to fruition. For example, he and his partners during the wintertime tried to ship ice to San Francisco. So they cut several tons of ice, loaded it on a ship, but the ship took 3 weeks to get to San Francisco because of the currents and whatever else befell a ship at the time, and all of the ice melted. Again, he's tried to shipload a host of chickens to San Francisco, but they all died en route. And then his farming endeavors, where he planted potatoes and turnips and wheat, and onions and corn, they all failed because there were floods where he planted his crops, and the weather was poor. There were unexpected cooling trends when he planted his crops. In 1853, he was promoted to captain and reassigned to Fort Humboldt in Northern California. He began to drink heavily and either was forced to resign his commission or subject himself to courts-martial, which he would not do because he felt that would be that would reflect poorly on his family and on himself. And he wrote his wife that he would not submit to courts-martial, but he would resign his commission instead. After resigning, he returned to Ohio to his father, who disapproved of his resignation. Now, his father was a hard man and never approved of Ulysses' endeavors. So whatever he did was never good enough for his father, who was a successful businessman with a tannery and a store that sold leather goods. And his father-in-law also was disappointed in him because he felt he couldn't support his daughter, Julia, who was the father-in-law's favorite daughter out of 4, and he couldn't support his family, which included 2 children now and 2 more soon to be born. Grant was now 32. He had spent 11 years in the service, and he also wondered about his future and whether he could support his children and Julia. He built his own house about a mile from the Dent's large house. The Dent's large house was called Whitehaven. So he called his house, which was built of logs, hardscrabble, and he did it in sort of defiance of the wonderful house that his father-in-law had. And he began farming on land belonging to his wife and hauled wood into St. Louis to sell. But all of his efforts came to failure. Therefore, Julia's father secured a position for Ulysses in the real estate firm of Harry Boggs. But Grant was mostly charged with collecting rents, but he was ill-suited for that, so he resigned. Then a position of county engineer opened. He felt he was well qualified for that because of his military training, but he lost out to others who had political connections with the mayor, and he lost out on other positions which opened. So he swallowed his pride and went to see his father about a job in the leather store in Galena, Illinois. Galena is in the far northwest corner of Illinois, probably about 150 miles from Milwaukee or Chicago. There he worked for a year with his 2 brothers, Orville and Simpson. And Simpson was ill with consumption or tuberculosis. Grant was able to pay his debts and maintain a household with his wife and children, Fred, Ulysses Jr., Nellie, and Jess. But the presidential election of 1860 presaged the coming Civil War. After Lincoln was elected, Fort Sumter was attacked and leveled. If you've ever been to Fort Sumter, which I have been, in Charleston Harbor, when you visit the National Historic Site, you can see that the whole fort was leveled by the bombardment, and they have reestablished some of the walls that surrounded the fort. But after the bombardment of several days or a week, the whole thing was leveled to the ground. As Fort Sumter was attacked, Lincoln called for volunteers to defend the Union. Grant, having been a military man, wanted to volunteer and sought a way to be useful. Rebuffed at first, he was used sparingly by the Illinois National Guard to train 30-day men around Illinois. 30-day men were soldiers who had enlisted for 30 days only. And it was up to the captains and the lieutenants who supported them to convince them to re-enlist for a 3-year period for the coming war. A permanent position was not found for Grant for a time until the governor of Illinois found a position as an aide to Adjutant Tom Mather. Then the governor appointed him commandant of Camp Yates, a recruiting depot. Then Yates appointed him colonel of Illinois Volunteers, 7th Regiment. Most of the West Point officers did not want to be part of the volunteer service or to have volunteers as their soldiers because they felt they were ill-suited for battle, had no training, etc. But Grant accepted his appointment because he really wanted to fight. His successes in the Western Front during the Civil War included successfully capturing Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee. Both are National Historic Sites, so you can visit them in Tennessee now. And in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg was a main success because Vicksburg was on the Mississippi River and was the route that the South used to replenish itself. So it was the major highway from the North to the South where the South could replenish itself with munitions and food, etc. And when Grant took Vicksburg, it was a great success for the North. The North had had very few successes in the Civil War until Forts Henry, Donelson, and Vicksburg. So Grant was celebrated in the newspapers because the reporters followed all the battles, noted the battles, stood on bluffs or other places far from the battle, but noted what was going on all the time. And in their reports, they reported that Grant successfully prosecuted these battles, and therefore his renown rose. And Lincoln said, I want this man because he fights. And after becoming commanding general of the entire Union Army, he secured the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. So I'm leaving out lots of details about the Civil War because Grant had many successes, including Shiloh. And Shiloh was one of the most bloody battles in the Civil War. About 23,000 total soldiers died, Union and Confederates. And the Confederates fled, and it was up to the Union to bury all the dead. And Grant detailed several men and a unit to bury all the dead, including the Confederates, which they did. Grant was drafted by the Republicans as their standard bearer in the presidential election of 1869. He being the hero of the Civil War. Grant won despite not wanting the office. He was drafted, and he took it because all of the other candidates that he saw them grasping for the office, for the power and the prestige of the office. And he really couldn't stand that. He couldn't stand that in the Civil War, and he couldn't stand that in politics. So he allowed himself to be drafted, and he won handily, becoming the president in 1869. After 2 presidential terms, 1869 through 1877, both terms were marred by nepotism. He had about 50 of his relatives that were employed in stations in Washington. So there was a lot of nepotism, and I imagine he did that because of his prior experiences dealing with poverty and not having a steady job or a steady income for his family. And there were lots of other scandals. He appointed people that he had served with in the military, but not all of them were useful in civilian life. They were good generals, they were good colonels and captains, but when it went to civilian life in Washington, D.C., a lot of times they succumbed to the bribes that were prevalent in the capital during that time. In 1878, he embarked on a trip around the world, and he had always loved traveling. So he had traveled during his youth, traveled in the forest where he was born and near where he was born, and he had traveled when he was dispatched to the barracks in St. Louis, the barracks at Fort Vancouver, and the barracks at Fort Humboldt. So he was well suited for travel. So in 1878, he embarked on a world tour. And during this tour, he was made the unofficial ambassador by President Hayes. And so he met lots of heads of state because he had been celebrated throughout the world as the commanding general and the winner of the Civil War. So his fame has spread worldwide. So everybody wanted to meet him. So he met Queen Victoria and had dinner with her at Buckingham Palace. He met Otto Bismarck here. And he met Benjamin Disraeli. He met the then ruler of China and Alfonso XII of Spain and many others because he visited all of the capitals of Europe. Accompanying Grant and his family on that trip around the world was John Russell Young, a journalist, I believe, for the New York Post. And he produced a 2-volume account of the tour after the tour ended. After 2+ years traveling, an exhausted Grant returned from his world tour, sailing from Japan on September 3rd, 1879, and arriving in San Francisco on September 20th. Upon his return to San Francisco, he had been there first in 1852. The city prepared a farewell dinner in his honor to be held at the Palace Hotel on Saturday, October 25th. This is the palace as it appeared to Grant at the time. More than 200 guests were invited. A magnificent multi-course meal was served. Each male guest was identified by a silver rectangular name card placed next to his spot at the banquet, which had been enclosed in a paper invitation. Mr. Gage's reads, "Farewell Banquet to General U.S. Grant, Palace Hotel, October 25, 1879, W.S. Gage." The sterling card for W.S. Gage, Esquire, weighs about 1.1 ounces, is approximately 2 1/4 by 3 5/8 inches, and came with an invitation, number 93, stating card of admission. The reverse is blank, save for the maker, A. Andrews, over here, the city, San Francisco, California, and sterling as a representation of what the card was made of. Below is the invitation to W.S. Gage, who was a prominent attorney in San Francisco of the day. W.S. Gage, Esquire, October 22nd, 1879, invited to the Palace Hotel, October 25, 1879. W.S. Gage practiced with his son, also named W.S. Gage. So far, I've traced 5 of the silver cards, which have sold within the past few years. I'm unsure if there are others, but I would bet that there are some, even though some may have been lost due to inadvertence or just not knowing their value. Note the initials of the former president on the paper invitation, U.S.G. for Grant. Andrew J. Bryant, Charles Crocker, W.M. Bunker, Charles Kohler, R.P. Hammond, Charles Mann, J.P. Jackson, D.F. Verdinall, George Houston, M.D., and Colonel W.E. MacArthur were responsible for arranging the banquet. Andrew J. Bryant was the mayor of San Francisco, and the others were prominent in San Francisco society of the time. Dinner began at 8:30. Guests were seated at long rows with a sterling silver card for each placed at his assigned seat. The menu was printed on satin, but in French in honor of the occasion. Grant perhaps did not imbibe much, as he was thought to be an alcoholic or a binge drinker, according to the newspaper accounts of his life. He probably was not an alcoholic, but a binge drinker because of his loneliness when he was assigned away from his family. He did drink some, and that was one reason that he resigned from the military in 1854. Wines came from local vendors and included whites, sherry, Zinfandel, muscatel, brandy, and Riesling. Mayor Brandt offered a toast at 10:15, and the ex-president responded in kind, thanking the banquet guests as follows. Gentlemen of San Francisco, the unbounded hospitality and cordiality with which I have been received since I put my foot on the soil of California has taken a deep root in my heart. It was more than I could have expected, and while it has been entailed a little fatigue at times, I assure you that I have been only grateful for it. I have previously been in California, upon the Pacific coast, but I have been away a quarter of a century and a little over since I landed here the first time. I hope that another quarter of a century will not elapse before I am able to pay a visit to it again. I am sure, as although I see no old men among the pioneers, that if I should remain away for another quarter of a century, I might be compelled to confess that some of you had grown old, and I want to see you again in your prime and in your youth. Gentlemen, in taking my departure, I want to thank you for the farewell reception that you have given me this evening, and express the hope that whether or not I am fortunate enough to visit this coast again, I shall meet you, one and all, elsewhere, and if it should not be in this life, that it shall be in a better country. After the band played for He's a Jolly Good Fellow, several toasts were given to honor California, San Francisco, the press, the South, Nevada, the American Bar, and military volunteers. Grant then prepared for his departure at 11:30, accompanied by Mr. Bryant. He and Mrs. Grant boarded a coach that delivered them to the ferry building. The ferry left at 11:50, arriving in Oakland a little while later, and Mr. Grant boarded a train to Virginia City, Nevada, then on to Ogden, Utah. Senator Sharon accompanied them as far as Virginia City, and J.A. Fillmore, Master of Transportation of the California Pacific Railroad, accompanied them as far as Ogden. Grant was the first four-star general of the United States, a rank created especially for him. This is a copper version of the gold medal that was given to him in 1865, I believe. That gold medal now resides in the Smithsonian Institution. And the reverse of same. Grant, because he suffered so many financial losses during his life and was loaned money by William Vanderbilt, the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt. So William Vanderbilt gave him $150,000. And Grant was unable to repay it right away. So he gave his gold medal and all the other mementos that he had received from the Civil War and all of his travels around the world. He gave all of that to Mr. Vanderbilt. And Mr. Vanderbilt tried to deny receiving it, but he was rebuffed because Grant always paid his debts. And Mr. Vanderbilt said, then I will give over all of these mementos to the nation once you have passed away. And he did. After repaying Vanderbilt, the American population gifted the former general and hero of the Civil War monies. So many people sent him $500 or $1,000. Even the ambassador from Mexico visited him at his New York apartment and left $1,000 on the table, which Grant and his wife paid back 1 month later. The editors of the Century magazine approached Grant, offering to give him $500 for articles he would write on his battles during the Civil War. And he started to write, but his first article was dismissed by the Century editors as perfunctory. But the editors persisted, asking Grant to write from the point of view of what he thought, what he saw, what he did during the campaigns, and to relate that to the man of no combat experience, so that man would understand. In the intervening time, Grant had been diagnosed with cancer. of the tongue, perhaps a result of his cigar and pipe smoking habit. As his wartime exploits were reported, and even after his military service, the public often sent boxes of cigar to the former general, numbering in the thousands. Mark Twain, his longtime friend, ran into one of the Century's editors, who bragged that he was having Grant write articles and paying him $500 per article. And Twain was very angry, and he went to Grant and he said, "Do not write articles for the Century because they are just hacks and they're not paying you enough. And I will pay you a greater sum." And after negotiations, Twain said, "I would give you 70% of any proceeds a book would make." Now, Grant, who was terminally ill, exhibited that discipline and persistence for which he was well known. He awoke early each morning and wrote for 4 hours. His son, Fred, assisted, as well as Adam Badeau, his former aide, gathering official papers, maps, and other materials that have allowed Grant to jog his exceptional memory. And he had a great memory of all the battles and all of the participants in the battles. In the evenings, he would revise and edit, and he would talk over the next day's writing with his son and Badeau. His health began to deteriorate in early 1885, so Twain suggested a stenographer to which Grant could dictate. Noble E. Dawson was hired, former secretary to Grant, on his trips to Mexico. His illness progressed to such a degree that he forced himself to sleep sitting up, fearing he would choke to death lying flat. But still, he continued to write. Grant did not believe his memoirs were literary, so he complained to his son Fred. Upon hearing this, Twain responded that he was currently reading Julius Caesar's commentaries, and in Grant's writing, the same high merits distinguish both books: clarity of statement, directness, simplicity, unpretentiousness, manifest truthfulness, fairness, and justice toward friend and foe alike, soldierly candor and frankness, and soldierly avoidance of flowery speech. The New York World published an article accusing Grant of not being the author of what was being published, that Badeau was the author, a claim disputed by Twain and Badeau, and refuted on numerous newspapers on their front pages. After Grant celebrated his 63rd birthday, he and Badeau parted ways. Badeau unjustly accused Grant of stalling Badeau's own novel. He was writing a novel about Cuba, and he accused Grant of not being a literary man. In June, to avoid New York's heat and humidity, Grant's doctors advised him to go to the mountains. So Grant traveled to Mount McGregor in the Adirondack Mountains near Saratoga Springs, New York. Here, he spent the last 6 weeks of his life finishing his memoirs. This is part of the Grant Cottage Historic Park. Grant died on July 23rd, 1885. This is the last known photograph of Grant at the cottage, reading a newspaper. Why was Ulysses S. Grant the first modern president? He used the power of the federal government to suppress the Ku Klux Klan when state authorities refused to prosecute them. He advocated for voting rights as a fundamental right of citizens. He created the first Civil Service Commission, probably as a result of the cronyism lodged against him. He formed the first Department of Justice. He signed into law an act naming Yellowstone National Park the first U.S. national park. He established the Surgeon General's office. He established the Army Weather Bureau, now the National Weather Service. He established the office of the Solicitor General. And he used executive orders to a great degree to make sure that Blacks in the former southern states would be able to vote and to hold office. All these actions are the hallmarks of a modern executive. And he is indeed buried in Grant's tomb, along with Julia, in Upper Manhattan in New York City. These are my sources. And I encourage anyone who's interested in Civil War to read his personal memoirs, which are lucid and clear and easy to read, although extensive, more than 500 pages for the 2 volumes. Questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Herb. That was great. Hey Herb. Did Grant's father survive to see his son's success finally?
He did survive some, and he saw Grant. I don't know if he survived to see Grant as the president, but he survived to see Grant become more successful with his children and his wife. But he was a hard man, so he never gave Grant any consideration or praise. Never.
Herb, I have a question.
Yes.
If Grant entered the military academy at the age of 17, as being 5 feet tall, how did he gain 7 inches while he was there?
An excellent question. And
that seems rather extraordinary.
He just did. That's extraordinary. I know. Well, I can tell you from a personal story.
What did they have for food there at the academy?
Meat and potatoes.
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, they grew their own. And in his memoirs, he never talks about the food there. But I'm sure they had meat and potatoes, because I was in the military and we had meat and potatoes almost every day. But I can tell you this. My youngest son went to the prom with my tuxedo, and I'm 5'8". So he was 5'8" as a senior in high school. He went off to junior college and grew 7 inches in 2 years.
Okay, well,
so it happens.
It can happen.
Who knows?
Yeah. Grant's medal is the largest U.S. Mint product. It was 105 millimeters.
Wow.
Prior to that was the medals that I wrote about for General Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. And
by the way, General Zachary Taylor and General Winfield Scott were heroes of Grant, and they both participated in the Mexican War. And that's how Grant got to know them. And he specifically liked Taylor because Taylor was unassuming and didn't put on airs, where Winfield Scott did. Winfield Scott would wear his uniform with medals and epaulets and things like that, and Taylor would not do so. So Grant was very taken with how Taylor operated as a general.
Yeah, Scott was older. They called him Old Fuss and Feathers.
Yes.
Grant also writes about the Mexican War in his memoirs.
Yes, he does.
And he basically says, look, we didn't really need to fight this war.
Well, he was basically against the war, and he thought that the U.S. as a larger country was imposing its will on a smaller country. So he had a great fondness for Mexico. And as a matter of fact, Johnson, after he assumed the presidency from Lincoln, tried to send Grant as ambassador to Mexico. But Grant was told by one of his aides, don't take that because they're just getting rid of you so that you won't be a political foil in the future.
Well, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Regarding his medal in the Smithsonian, it is there. I have not seen it, but I've seen a picture of it, and it's in a box, a casket kind of thing, which is also extremely ornate. I do not know if it's actually on display. It would be in the Museum of American History, and I've not seen it there. And I've kind of gone through that museum up and down about 1 million times.
Yeah.
I don't, and the same's true with Scott's medal. It's also in the Smithsonian, also in a casket like that, very ornate.
Yeah, I would love to see them. I don't know if the Smithsonian has photographed those things because they keep photographing all their stuff. So they can put it on the web.
It is photographed. I think it's SI for Smithsonian Institute.gov or .edu. I'm not sure.
Okay. I'll look for that.
Thanks. That was a great talk. I loved it. Yeah.
Other question.
One other thing. Over here. Yeah. Can I, if I can mention one other thing, I happen to have a first edition of his memoirs, the 2 volumes, and which I just got off my shelf. In case you can see them, and I'm holding them up in case you can see my image. Perfect. Yeah.
Now I think.
On that. Do you know if I want to follow up on that? Does anybody know if his memoirs are on books.google.com?
They are.
Okay,
They're
cool.
all over the place, and they've not been out of print for the years since Samuel Clemens published them.
Yeah. They were very popular.
Yes, they were.
Yeah,
And Grant was very popular. He was so popular, even through the scandals, he probably could have been elected a third term, but he handpicked Rutherford B. Hayes to be his successor, and then regretted it later.
Yeah. Huh.
He regretted it because Rutherford B. Hayes took all of the troops that were imposing martial law in the South. He took all of the troops away. And that was part of his deal to become the president when the commission, the Electoral Commission, made him the president.
Right. That was sort of the end of Reconstruction.
It was the end of Reconstruction.
Yeah, right.
And Grant was he was very much in favor of the former slaves being able to vote, to hold office, and to not be violated against. So he had martial law in several states a couple of times, in Louisiana, in South Carolina. He decimated the KKK, which did not re-arise until the 1915-16 era. And so he did a lot of good things for the US. And he was, because of the scandals during his administration, he was always downgraded as a president. And the recent biographies, there are 3 recent biographies in the 2016, 17, 18, 19, that have reevaluated his stature. And so his stature has been rising because of that. And because of the other things that he did. He promoted an equal voting rights law, and a lot of other things that are that sort of mirror what's going on today in the politics.
Yeah.
Hey, Herb, can I ask you something? This is Mike.
Yes.
I found it interesting that quote you had from him on his dedication on finishing something once he started it. And my understanding of the Civil War is that, and Grant in particular, is that he was not always popular during the early battles with the Northern press because he was willing to take heavy casualties because he realized the advantage the North had in the number of soldiers, and they called him Grant the Butcher and things like that in the newspapers. So he's very popular after he won the war, but he wasn't popular throughout the entire war. Is that what you're reading of it too?
That's
Thank
correct.
you.
He was popular when he won the first 3 battles at Donelson and at Vicksburg and so on. Because the Union had not won any battles on the Eastern Front. So the Western Front was sort of where they were winning the war. And he came to understand that the South would not be subdued in a matter of weeks, which most of the people in the newspapers in the North believed the South would succumb in a matter of weeks. And after he fought those battles at Donelson and the other forts and at Shiloh, where he took heavy casualties, he understood that it would be a war of attrition. And so he was relentless in taking the casualties, but winning the overall battle. And he always put the rebels on the run. He would not back off.
Right.
That was his great success. And probably that is why Lincoln called him to the Eastern Front to take over from the other generals who would not pursue the Confederates into the South, because Grant would do so. And
Thank
even though
you.
he took a lot of casualties, and he did, remember the Civil War, the whole Civil War took 600,000 deaths, Union and Confederate, 600,000. So in a country of 25 million, that's a lot of people dying.
Another question, Herb.
Yes.
That silver plate for the dinner that was for someone named W.S. Gage.
Yes.
Where is that? Where did you find that? Or
I found it at a flea market.
oh, I see. So you have it.
I have it.
Oh, well, that's great. Yeah, maybe
Yeah.
you mentioned that and I just missed it.
No,
Yeah,
no, you probably didn't. I have that. I saw it at a flea market one day, and I looked at it, and it said U.S. Grant. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I wonder what this is all about. And the guy said, he quoted a price, and I said, oh my God, that's a lot of money. And I said, I got to think about that. So, and I went wandering around the flea market, and it just struck me that this is something that's way too historic to leave behind. So I went back and made a deal and paid the guy over time, and I have it. And I have, there's one on that's portrayed or pictured on the internet on the Palace Hotel site. There's a site that details the history of the Palace Hotel, and you can see that one. And one was sold by an outfit in Sacramento 4 or 5 years ago. And 2 have been sold, I think, by Heritage Auctions in the last 10 years or so. Those are the only 5 that I've traced, but I bet there are others out there sort of hidden away in drawers or whatnot that people don't know what they are.
Yeah. So is that what got you interested in U.S. Grant?
Well, it is. You know, I was interested before because I was interested in the Civil War, but this had a really good tie-in. So then I got his biographies, and I read those, and his memoirs, and I read those. And I thought, well, you know, this will be a good thing for a paper for the PCNS. So I did the paper and I sent it in, and that should be part of our current papers thing.
It is.
Good.
It's a fascinating story. And he's a fascinating individual because all of his life was filled with failure until he became a Civil War soldier. And nothing else accrued to him in a positive light. Maybe his wife and his family. And he was completely devoted to his wife and family. And she was there at his side when he died in Mount McGregor in New York. She was there at his side holding his hand when he died. So he was completely devoted to her, and she was devoted to him.
Cool.
Great job.
Thank you, Herb.
Welcome.
You can